I first fell in love with horror when I was in primary school. I grew up in the state of Columbia here in the Pacific Northwest in the US, which is so naturally dreary and spooky that it just felt like an inevitability. And my grade 3 classroom had a decent selection of children's horror books, which was kind of unique to most of the classrooms in my primary school. This teacher in particular loved horror. And I remember wanting to read something spooky and finding the first book in a 90s children's horror series that is not talked about nearly enough, Five Nights at Freddy's. Now, you'd be forgiven for not knowing what Five Nights at Freddy's is. It was a very niche series of books belonging to a genre that was mostly seen as dead at the time they were released. I mean, nowadays, children's horror has become insanely popular due to the explosive success of the Goosebumps series of video games for the Sega consoles. And funnily enough, Five Nights at Freddy's actually had a video game deal signed to start making video games published by Nintendo, but shortly afterwards, Nintendo lost the console wars to Sega and the deal fell through. But don't feel too bad for the author of Five Nights at Freddy's. He would later go on to create the Chipper and Sons children book series that is quite popular to this day. But before he wrote those books, he wrote the Five Nights at Freddy's books under a pseudonym Jeremy Fitzgerald. The Five Nights at Freddy's books, or 5NAF as fans of the series call it, were controversial upon release, and the author almost stopped writing because of this backlash. The series was marketed towards children, but the books are notably dark in tone. The first book in particular is actually pretty scary and deals with some heavy themes. Now, I'm a big fan of introducing kids to horror. The Goosebumps games were really good at that when they started out, but they've certainly toned down the scare factor recently. But even I think the first book in this series is on the verge of crossing some lines. I think most kids wouldn't understand what's really going on, but the implications are pretty terrifying. But this is also why the series holds up so well today, and it's a shame that we only ever got 5 books in the series before the author started writing Chipper and Sons. But I have a huge soft spot for the 5NAF series, so today I'm going to be taking a trip down memory lane and talking about an incredibly niche series that I'm sure only a few of you barely remember. This one certainly is not for the algorithm. Remember to follow me here on MeTube. I'm trying to reach 100,000 followers by the end of 2025. Also make sure to rate the video 5 stars as well. That helps my page really grow. But without further ado, let's talk about the forgotten childhood horror of Five Nights at Freddy's. Just so we're clear, I'm only going to be talking about the first 5NAF book today. I was thinking about covering all of them, but I ended up having a lot more to say about this first one than I realized. If you would like me to cover the later books, then let me know in the reply section up above. I'd like to cover those someday if there's a demand for it, because I actually did have a ton of fun writing this script about this book in particular. It was a wild ride to go back through this again. Five Nights at Freddy's starts with an entire page dedicated to 3 lines. Yellow Bear isn't a stranger, Yellow Bear needs help, follow me. We'll talk about what those lines mean a little later on in the video because they are very important, but we don't have the context for them yet. The first real chapter of the story takes place during a primary school recess where we are introduced to a group of 3 5th grade friends, David, Henry, and Evan. David is our de facto main character, and most of the story takes place from his perspective. He's a pretty generically written kid main character. He's more of an audience surrogate than anything. He lives in the town of Twister, Utah with his older brother Greg and his dad. We aren't actually ever given the dad's name, and we also don't know what happened to his mother. It isn't addressed in this book. His dad has just recently been hired to try to clean up and repair the old local hotspot called Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. It was shut down a decade ago under mysterious circumstances. The book makes a point of David's dad not knowing who hired him, just that it's his responsibility to fix up the animatronics inside and get the place cleaned out. He mostly took the job because it pays pretty well, and the family are allowed to live in a little double-wide trailer home out behind the restaurant. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria is very similar to what we know today as Chuck E.'s Pizza Time Theater, or Chuck E. Cheese as it was known back in the 80s and 90s. It was a pizza restaurant with a bunch of pinball machines where animatronic characters would do a little stage show for the kids, and it used to be very popular. The animatronics at Freddy Fazbear's were unique in that they would walk around freely using a little trick that will be discussed later on in the novel. But all you need to know is that there are 4 animatronics: Freddy Fazbear, Chica the Chicken, Bonnie the Bunny, and Foxy the Pirate Fox. They are about what you would expect from animatronics at one of these places in the 90s. They're like massive hulking animatronics with lifeless eyes and permanent smiles. There's definitely something freaky about this though. I remember being freaked out as a kid when we would go to Fleischerland and see the animatronics there. So the author has certainly tapped into some sort of primal fear that a lot of people have. But going back to the kids, David is sort of the ringleader of the group, but this is kind of a new development. 2 weeks before the story starts, their friend William went missing. Police have been searching for him, but no one has been able to find him. It's pretty spooky stuff. William was the one in the group that was obsessed with Freddy Fazbear's, and his main reason for adding David to their friend group was because his dad started working there. And there's sort of a constant tension in the air when the kids talk about Freddy Fazbear's because it reminds them of William. They seem to not want to think about him because it makes them sad. Evan is the more aggressive friend of the group. He is constantly getting into trouble and carries around a slingshot in his backpack that he made himself. The first chapter tells us that this is his 5th slingshot since they keep getting confiscated by their teacher, Mr. Patrick. More on him later. I like Evan. He can be a little obnoxious at times with how he is constantly trying to one-up his friends and challenge them to like races or whatever else he can think of, but he's a good kid. Henry is the quietest of the three and was super close with William before he went missing. The story takes note of the fact that he was significantly more animated and loud when William was around. Whereas before, the group felt balanced because Evan and David were kind of best friends and Henry and William were kind of best friends. Now everything feels out of balance. The book starts with Evan challenging the other kids to a race, winning, and then gloating and rubbing it in their faces like most kids that age would do. He tells David and Henry that he is as fast as Foxy, one of the animatronics again, and this starts the kids talking about Freddy Fazbear's and something they refer to as Yellow Bear. It seems there's sort of an urban legend regarding a 5th member of the Freddy Fazbear crew, an animatronic that looks similar to Freddy but has yellow fur instead of brown fur. If you remember, the very first page of the novel had lines that were seemingly spoken by this Yellow Bear. The kids treat Yellow Bear as some sort of boogeyman. They make jokes about it coming to get them in the night, and Evan and David laugh about this, but Henry is more serious. He says that William told him that he had been seeing Yellow Bear outside his window at night, and that was the week that he went missing. This seems to make the other kids uncomfortable, and Evan tells him that he's lying and that he shouldn't be making jokes about William, but Henry insists that that's what William told him, so Evan starts to push Henry. David steps in and breaks up the fight, and then Evan storms off in a huff, and David tells Henry that Yellow Bear is just a myth and that he isn't real, and Henry seems to kind of reluctantly agree to this. The recess bell then rings, and the kids go back to their class with their strange teacher, Mr. Patrick. Mr. Patrick is comedically unsatisfied with his job teaching in primary school. It feels like he really hates the kids, and it seems like he has it out especially bad for David. You see, Mr. Patrick is completely obsessed with Freddy Fazbear's. He's got decorations and memorabilia from the pizzeria all over his classroom, and it feels kind of out of place for a primary school. And he holds some resentment towards David's family because he's been saving up for years to eventually purchase the rundown Freddy Fazbear's, but it never went up for sale. But since the restaurant wasn't being used or cleaned for years, the state was getting ready to repossess the restaurant and list it up for auction, but then the owner hired David's dad. So while neither David nor his dad did anything wrong, Mr. Patrick sees them as the people that crushed his dream of owning the pizzeria. After school, David walks most of the way home with Henry since they only live a block away from each other, and Henry tells him that he's worried something bad happened to William. David tells him not to worry and that William will probably be back in school pretty soon, and this seems to cheer Henry up a bit before the two of them part ways. When David gets home, he goes back to his room and sees that his dad is working in the pizzeria. The way that the pizzeria and the house are kind of situated is that David's room is on the very back of it, so through the back window, he can see the back door of the pizzeria. And the back door is made of glass, so he can see through it. This is going to become important later on in the story, so I'm just getting this all out there now. But he walks into the back of the pizzeria, and we can see that everything is a complete mess. Most things are covered in white sheets, and there's a thick layer of dust over pretty much everything, and also none of the lights work. David looks down the hall that sits to the left of the back door to the pizzeria, and we learn that there are animatronics being kept in a storage room at the end of the dark hallway, and it's kind of this eerie, spooky image. David calls out to his dad and doesn't walk down the spooky dark hallway and instead walks the other way, which takes him to the stage area. And he rounds the corner to see Chica, the large yellow animatronic with a metal beak and lifeless eyes, staring at him. This scares David, who screams, understandably, but then his dad appears from behind it and calms him down. We can see that his dad was wearing headphones, and that's why he didn't hear David calling out for him. He tells David that he is trying to fix Chica so that she can walk around like she used to, and he describes what the book calls the spring lock system that the animatronics have. Each of the animatronics can act as a robot, or they can be worn as a suit by turning a crank on the back of the animatronic that moves all of the robotic parts to the edges of the entire suit system thing. This allows someone to climb in and use it like a suit and walk around, which is how the animatronics used to be able to roam freely. David thinks this is really cool and asks if he can get inside. His dad tells him that he's not allowed to go inside the suits because they're old and the spring lock system can be dangerous if not properly taken care of. He says that sometimes the metal parts will snap back into place suddenly. When this happens, the person on the inside would essentially be skewered by a bunch of robotic parts, which sounds incredibly terrifying and painful to me. This is kind of our first sign that this kid's horror book is actually a little more disturbing than you would expect. And I love this kind of stuff, but I could see why some parents would be a little bit mad about this. But David's dad tells him that if the suit were to get wet when someone was inside, it would trigger a spring lock failure. He twists the crank on the back and all the parts snap into place with a loud crunch sound. He tells David that after they have fixed all the suits, if David ever hears that crunching sound, it means there was a spring lock failure and he needs to get to an adult right away. Despite how terrifying this sounds to us, David doesn't really seem to grasp how serious a spring lock failure would be. He sees it as more of a discomfort rather than an impaling. This is partially the fault of his dad, who tends to dance around some of the more graphic details, but this failure to properly explain the consequences of a spring lock failure will come back later. David asks his dad if he's fixed any of the other animatronics, and his dad tells him that he hasn't even touched the ones in the storage room and is only focusing on Chica right now. They leave the pizzeria and David's dad locks the back door behind them. David goes to his room to find his older brother Greg looking through his things. Greg is in high school and is pretty consistently rude to David. He pushes him before leaving the room and David goes to sleep for the night. I should say that the reason this book is even called Five Nights at Freddy's is because the entirety of the story takes place over 1 week, and each night something strange happens at the pizzeria. David wakes up in the middle of the first night and sees a faint light coming in through his window. He looks outside to see there was a light on inside the pizzeria. He gets up to investigate this himself, not wanting to wake his dad up, and walks out the back door to the pizzeria. The door is unlocked, and David walks inside, a little scared. He looks down the dark hallway that leads to the storage room and calls out to anyone inside. No one answers. He can see a flashlight on the ground ahead of him where the Chica animatronic was earlier in the day. David slowly walks forward and wonders where Chica went. He reaches down to pick the flashlight up before Chica steps out from around the corner and starts walking towards him. David screams and backs up, trying to make it to the door. He trips and looks back as Chica advances towards him, this hulking, lifeless figure just barely illuminated by the flashlight. It's a pretty freaky description. Just as Chica is about to grab him, David hears laughter coming from inside the suit. He shines the flashlight at Chica and sees Greg climbing out from the back of it. Greg laughs at him and tells him that he should have seen the look on his face, and David is completely furious and tells Greg that he's going to tell Dad what he did. Greg reminds him that their dad would be furious if he knew that David went out at night. It appears their dad has been especially cautious since William went missing. David tells Greg that the next time he tries to scare him like this, he'll have a surprise waiting for him. He starts to think of a way that he could pour water on the suit next time. It seems that he wants to trigger a spring lock failure on his brother. Again, he hasn't had the consequences of this fully explained to him yet. The next chapter starts with our three friends back at school. David tells Evan and Henry about how Greg scared him, but also about how cool the pizzeria is. He tells them all about the old pinball machines that he saw, and the boys come up with the idea to find a bunch of change and then have a sleepover in the pizzeria later in the week. This idea comes about when David talks a little bit about how scary Chica looked at night. Evan tells him that he needs to man up and get over his fear, and Henry suggests that they sleep inside the pizzeria. This whole situation reminds me so much of when I was growing up and my grandma had this playhouse that they had built in the backyard that my brothers and I were terrified of for some reason. We decided that the best way to try to get over our fear was to try to sleep there at night, but for some reason we picked September 3rd, American Independence Day, to attempt this. So there were fireworks going off all night long, and it just kept us on edge to the point that we all went back inside and gave up on the whole thing. Just a story this book reminded me of. Evan says that if Greg tries to scare David again, he needs to be ready for him, and he gives him one of his slingshots. Now armed with the slingshot, David goes back home and finds his dad cleaning up the inside of the pizzeria. He says that he's done trying to fix the animatronics for now. He shows David some of the cool pinball machines, and David asks if he and his friends can have a sleepover there. He thinks about it for a second and then tells them that they can on Thursday night. His dad says that he'll need to clean up the stage area so they can use it as a place to put their sleeping bags on. David goes over to look at Chica, and his dad tells him to not touch the animatronic. Apparently there was an issue when he was trying to test the sprinkler system where one of the ceiling sprinklers went off and it got the Chica suit all wet. He tells David that he needs to dry out. He again reminds him about the spring locks and says that they are very likely to snap back to the center of the suit right now and that it will take a few days before he can safely move it again. David goes back to his house to do his homework, and Greg jumps out from behind the couch and scares him. It seems that Greg really gets a kick out of terrorizing his younger brother. I kind of wish we got got more characterization for Greg. It almost seems like the book wants to tie in his meanness to the fact that their mom isn't in the picture anymore, but it isn't really elaborated on. And you'd think that in the later books, the series would maybe focus on this more, but again, the absence of Greg and David's mom is never addressed in this series. It's kind of odd. But even though he's a little one-dimensional, Greg does fit that 90s bully trope to a T, and I kind of love that for him. He's just so cartoonishly terrible to David. But anyways, David goes to sleep and yet again wakes up in the middle of the night. With this, we have our second night at Freddy's, and he looks out the bedroom window at the pizzeria. He sees two eyes lit up and staring at him through the glass door of the back entrance to Freddy's. Convinced that Greg is trying to scare him again, he grabs the slingshot and heads outside. He picks up a few rocks on his way to the back door of the pizzeria and finds that it is yet again unlocked. He assumes that Greg must be stealing the key from his dad at night. The eyes are no longer staring at him through the glass, so he opens the door and yells into the darkness, telling Greg that he has a slingshot and that he isn't afraid to use it. From the darkness, Greg hears the sound of one of the animatronics talking. It's saying some of the regular voice lines that are programmed into it, and here is what it says. "Why, look who it is. It's the birthday boy. It's time for some music. Let's hop to it. Let's get this party started. Let's get this party started. It's time for some music. Let's hop to it. All aboard the party train," and man, I could really go for some more pizza. And those voice lines in that order repeat over and over again, and David calls out to Greg again, telling him to knock it off. But then he looks over and sees Chica standing where his dad left it. David walks around the back of the animatronic and sees that the spring locks are still in place and no one is inside it. As he's checking this out, he hears loud footsteps coming towards him. Coming around the far side of the stage is Bonnie the bunny. David is startled by this since his dad told him that Bonnie and the rest of the animatronics haven't left the storage room. He hides behind Chica and loads his slingshot. He knows that pelting Greg while he's in the suit won't really hurt him, but it should be enough to rattle him so he stops trying to scare him. He steps out from behind Chica and Bonnie is standing right in front of him, staring at him. He reaches out towards David and David panics and runs for the back door. Bonnie continues advancing towards him and David runs out the door, but just before he leaves, he can hear the sound of someone laughing behind him. He goes back inside his house. As he's walking back to his room, he hears snoring coming from Greg's bedroom. It wasn't Greg in the suit after all. Something that I always thought was neat about this series was the idea of the animatronics being both robots and suits that people can wear. It's a really cool concept. It makes moments like Bonnie walking around extra freaky because you don't know if it was just the robot walking around on its own or if there was someone inside the suit. Personally, you couldn't pay me enough to climb into a suit that has the potential to skewer me to death, but that's just kind of the risk you run when working at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, I guess. The later books actually go into more detail about what it was like working there, and one of the books even covers why the restaurant closed in the first place. But I can appreciate that the scope of this first book is pretty focused. It's mostly concerned with just delivering some scares every night in a spooky pizzeria, and it does a really good job of that. But if this book was just a formulaic story of David getting scared by something every night in the pizzeria, then we wouldn't be talking about it today. So buckle up because things are about to get a little weird and very disturbing. David decides not to mention what happened last night in the pizzeria, but he does ask his dad if he ended up fixing Bonnie, and his dad says that he hasn't even touched Bonnie yet. He tells David that he's going to clean up a lot of the stage area today and get some of the pinball machines working again for David's sleepover with his friends. The sleepover isn't happening this night, but the next because David still needs to tell his friends about it, and then they need to tell their parents about it. He heads to school and sees cop cars outside the front office. All the kids are standing and watching as Mr. Patrick is led away in handcuffs. David asks Evan and Henry about what happened, and Henry says that they are taking him in for questioning. Apparently, the police think he may have had something to do with William's disappearance. Mr. Patrick looks pissed about the whole thing like he always does and swears that he's going to sue the police for this. But honestly, if Mr. Patrick didn't want to be accused of murdering a kid, then he should probably spend less time being outwardly hostile towards the children that he teaches. I like the character of Mr. Patrick because he reads like the caricature of a mean teacher. He's like always doing pop quizzes and keeps the kid in for recess and does all the mean stuff like that. His obsession with Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria actually gets explained a bit more in a later book because it feels kind of out of place in this one, but I think it's a fun touch. It's hard to explain, but the book does a really good job of making the town of Twister, Utah feel like it has just gone downhill since Freddy's closed, like it was all the town had. Fun fact, back in the 60s, after the success of Fleischer Studios and Fleischerland, an early competitor of theirs, Disney, tried to make their own Fleischerland called Disneyland. And it's funny that Disneyland sounds so weird to me because Fleischer Pleasureland is just somebody's last name and land, but for some reason that sounds way more natural than Disneyland. But anyways, they had these grand plans to make a theme park in North Carolina and were convinced that it would be a huge success, and the town that it was built in completely bought into this idea. But then Disneyland opened and it was a complete flop. There was just no name recognition like Fleischer had with Popeye. Kids weren't lining up to see Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. So Disneyland closed after only a year, and the entire community that was built around it went to a sort of like micro recession. It was like the town died the day that the theme park closed. And then Disney itself went out of business a year after that, and that's why none of you guys have probably ever heard of it. I'm just a massive fan of the Me Too page, Bygone World Entertainment, which is why I know about all this stuff. But anyways, the author does a really good job of making the obsession that Mr. Patrick has with Freddy's believable, since he would have grown up being completely surrounded by it. Back to the story, the kids have a substitute teacher for the day, Miss Vanessa, who seems really nice. At recess, David tells Henry and Evan about the sleepover, and they're all stoked about it. Evan asks him whether he used the slingshot on his brother, and David lies and says that he didn't even end up going inside the pizzeria last night. He doesn't want to scare his friends since he's super excited about this sleepover, and he knows that his dad will be moving the animatronics back into the storage room anyways. Henry asks David and Evan if they think that Mr. Patrick had something to do with William's disappearance, and they say that they don't think so. They definitely believe that Mr. Patrick hates them, but they don't think that he would want to hurt them. I would have thought that they would have written the kids as being convinced that their teacher took their friend, but I like that William's disappearance is treated pretty seriously. It's a bold move to start your children's book off with a kid being missing, and the rest of this book is seriously going to call into question whether this can be classified as a children's horror book. But like I said, I loved this book when I was in primary school, even if I don't think I really understood what exactly happens near the end of the story, but I'm getting ahead of myself. David goes back home and his dad shows him the stage area that he's cleaned up for him and his friends. He's pulled out some pinball machines and dusted them off and cleaned them so they can play all night long. He tells him that he will have to lock the doors while they are in there because he doesn't want anyone else getting in. This makes David a little nervous, but he isn't sure why. His dad tells him that he needs to run to the store to get some stronger cleaning supplies because the storage room with the animatronics smells terrible. He also says that he told Greg to move Chica back into the storage room tonight before he heads out. Greg is going to stay with one of his high school buddies for the next 2 nights. David is really stoked about how his sleepover is shaping up and runs back to the house to finish his homework. As the sun goes down and it starts to get dark, he sees something. Looking out the window of their living room at the woods behind the house, he thinks he sees one of the animatronics walking through the trees, but he isn't quite so sure. He keeps staring out the window but doesn't see anything else, so he assumes it was just a deer or something. He goes to bed. The third night is different from the previous 2 nights because it's from Greg's perspective. It's late and Greg has to go move Chica before he's allowed to go to his friend's house. The back door to the pizzeria is unlocked again and he goes inside to find Chica near the stage where he last saw her. His dad has tied some ropes to her. The bottom of Chica's feet have wheels on them, and Greg is supposed to slowly roll her back to the storage room. But the issue is that the wheels are old and rusted, and Chica is incredibly hard to move. Frustrated with how slow this entire process is, Greg decides that he's just going to get inside the animatronic and walk it over to the storage room since that would be much faster. Now you might be thinking, this is a children's book. There's no way that happens to Greg. Well, now you might understand why this book was a little controversial when it released. Greg climbed into the animatronic suit, still a little damp from the sprinkler incident a few days ago. His dad had told him not to do this, but it was getting late and there was no other way this piece of junk was getting to the storage room. Like he had done 2 nights ago, he started walking from the stage area to the dark hallway leading to his destination. Despite the fact this wasn't his first time wearing the robotic skeleton of Chica, he was still surprised at how easy it was to walk in it. He made quick work of the trip back down the dark hallway and was relieved when he saw that the door to the room with the other animatronics was already open. This relief only lasted a few seconds before a trickle of fear started to work its way into his mind. Hadn't the storage room been closed just a few minutes ago when he walked in? He decided that the best solution to this building fear inside him was to put the suit away quickly. He marched into the room and was immediately struck by a foul-smelling odor. His dad had told him that he needed to get some stronger cleaning supplies for the smell back here, but Greg was convinced that the only way to get rid of a smell this bad was to knock the building down and start over again. He walked over to the empty spot in the room where Chica belonged and looked at the unblinking eyes and smiling expressions of Foxy, Bonnie, and Freddy. Something about these animatronics creeped him out. Greg started to step out of the Chica suit, but felt his leg catch on something. His jeans were hooked to one of the animatronic parts. This didn't happen the last time he was in this situation. Greg panicked for a moment and took a few deep breaths to calm down. He looked through the limited view that the Chica suit gave him at the other 4 characters staring at him. Wait, 4? Weren't there only supposed to be 3? Foxy, Freddy, and Bonnie. Was there another suit that his dad never told him about? He could barely see this other suit staring at him in the darkness, but it didn't look like the 4 that he knew. Though it was dark, he thought he saw the suit moving. It was twitching, moving almost imperceptibly. Tiny convulsions that reminded Greg of laughing. Then he heard it, the low, faint chuckling. It was coming from this yellow suit. As soon as his mind registered what he was looking at, his body sprung into action. He needed to get out of the pizzeria immediately. He pulled his leg back as hard as he could, not caring if he ripped his jeans in the process. The machinery still held on to him. The yellow Freddy suit in front of him was convulsing more now. He could hear the laughter growing louder and louder. He pulled his leg back again. Still, the robotic skeleton of Chica held him in place. Finally, with every ounce of strength that he had, Greg pulled his leg back. He heard the victorious sounds of his jeans ripping. He had torn himself free. But the feeling of victory only lasted for a little less than a second. Immediately after the sound of the rip came the sound of a wet, metallic crunch. So yeah, David's teenage older brother was just skewered to death inside of an animatronic. This book was made for children, by the way. Talk about one of the most brutal ways to kill a character. I think having Greg be spring-locked like this would have been pretty gnarly either way, but his panic leading up to it makes it so much worse to me. He is literally in this horrible-smelling storage room looking at someone in a yellow Freddy suit, a yellow bear, who is laughing at him while he struggles to get himself free. I think the addition of Yellow Bear is pretty cool. The book mentions that the suit doesn't look like the other animatronics. It's not nearly as big as they are and doesn't seem to have any metallic components to it. It looks like either an earlier version of the Freddy Fazbear suit or something that someone just put together themselves. The later books explain what it really is, but I don't want to spoil that for you guys. But we will be seeing more of this Yellow Bear before the story is over, so let's get into the next day now that our third night at Freddy's is over and done with. David has breakfast with his dad, who tells him that he bought some stronger cleaning supplies, but that he's going to wait to clean the storage room until tomorrow. It's the night of the sleepover, and he doesn't want the kids to be breathing in those harsh chemicals all night. Besides, the animatronics are all in the storage room, out of sight. We are reminded again that Greg is supposed to be staying with his friend for the next 2 days, which acts as a convenient reason as to why neither David nor David's dad are worried about him being gone. David's dad reminds him again that he will be locking the boys inside the pizzeria that night, and that he has already set out their sleeping bags and flashlights on the stage. He shows David a big bucket of change that he's collected from the pinball machines and tells him that they can use the money to play pinball all night. There's a funny moment here where David is completely stunned by his dad's generosity in giving them all this change because he doesn't realize that his dad is just getting the money back anyways. His dad picks up on this astonishment but doesn't correct him. He's just stoked that his kid and his friends are going to have the coolest sleepover ever tonight. It is interesting that the pinball machines were still full of coins. This lends more credence to the theory that the pizzeria was abandoned suddenly and no one has gone back since. David goes to school and tells Henry and Evan about the sleepover and the big bucket of coins. They tell him that they both got permission to stay at the pizzeria for the sleepover. Mr. Patrick isn't back to teaching quite yet. It seems like the police still have him in custody and that he might actually have something to do with Michael's disappearance. The kids are so excited for the sleepover that the rest of the day seems to pass by at an absolute crawl. This is honestly a very relatable feeling to me. I remember back in school when the new Sonic R came out for the Sega Jupiter. It felt like every minute lasted an hour and I was just so stoked to play it when I got home. Great game, by the way. But anyways, the rest of the day is pretty uneventful except for this moment where Henry pulls David aside and starts to talk to him about Yellow Bear again. He tells him that he's pretty sure that he saw Yellow Bear in the woods behind his house yesterday, and he's definitely a little shaken up by this. If you'll remember, Henry and David only live about a block away from each other, so there was a good chance that Henry saw what David thought he saw walking through the woods yesterday. Combine this with the laughing yellow bear costume that Greg saw last night before he got skewered to death, and things aren't looking too good for our main characters. Henry reminds David that William told him he had been seeing Yellow Bear outside his window the week that he went missing, and he says that those two things must be connected. David tries to get Henry to stop talking about this, but Henry is completely obsessed at this point. He's been shy and quiet this whole book, but now it's like he's in some sort of conspiratorial frenzy. He tells David that Mr. Patrick must be Yellow Bear since he's so obsessed with Freddy's, and that he always hated their group of friends. It all seems to make sense to him. David tells Henry that he doesn't know what he's talking about, but secretly, he thinks that he might be onto something. Either way, he doesn't want to worry about it right now. The kids all go home together after school, and David's dad lets them inside the pizzeria. The kids are completely stoked to see all of the pinball machines, and David's dad even bought them some pizza. I do want to say that even though this sleepover isn't going to end up being a positive experience for these kids, it's a sweet gesture from David's dad. I would have loved something like this when I was little. It really does sound like the dream of every 90s child, although like I said, things aren't going to go too well for our kids here. David's dad locks the back door behind them and tells them that they have to be super careful because if anything breaks, he will be held responsible for the damages. We learn that David's dad's boss only communicates with him over the phone about once a week. He thinks this is a little strange, but doesn't care since the money keeps coming in. But he doesn't even know his employer's name. He just refers to him as the phone guy throughout the course of the book. It's definitely a mysterious work arrangement. The kids play pinball and mess around for a few hours, and everything seems to be going totally fine. Although at one point, Henry thinks he hears the back door open. Later into the night, the kids all get inside their sleeping bags on the stage and start trying to scare each other with ghost stories. It's all going fine until David brings up Yellow Bear. This seems to really rattle Henry, who tells him that he doesn't want to talk about Yellow Bear anymore. The kids are quiet for a moment before Henry says, "I'm worried William isn't coming back." The kids all sit in silence for a minute before Evan tells him that William has to come back, and he asks who would have taken him, and David responds with, Mr. Patrick. Evan is confused, and Henry tells him about their theory that Mr. Patrick is the person who kidnapped William and that he might be the one in the yellow bear costume. And at this point, all three of the kids seem to be on board with this logic, but David says that he just wants to go to sleep and they can talk about it more in the morning, and the other kids agree. They all fall asleep, but David is briefly woken up in the middle of the night by what sounds like a door opening. He ignores this and falls back asleep. A little bit later, he is woken up again by Evan, who is laughing and asking Henry and David which one of them brought the stink bomb in. David notices a horrible smell in the air. The kids are all laughing about the situation and start wrestling with each other, trying to figure out who is responsible for the stink bomb, but then they hear a voice coming from down the hall. It's Bonnie the Bunny saying its familiar voice lines. It's saying the same lines we heard earlier in the same order on repeat. David says that it must be Greg trying to scare him. He tells them that they are going to make Greg pay for messing with them. The kids can hear Bonnie's voice coming from the end of the hallway leading to the storage room. They look down the dark hallway and can see the massive figure of the animatronic stepping out of the room. Bonnie is much bigger than the kids had imagined, so all three of them panic and run back towards the stage, hiding behind some of the pinball machines. As they are hiding, they can hear Bonnie walking down the long hallway. Then they hear an unfamiliar voice line saying, "Who's ready for some cake?" This voice is higher than Bonnie's, and David notices that it sounds like there is more than just one of the animatronics heading down the hallway. Bonnie steps around the corner and into view, and so does Chica. The kids are absolutely terrified by these hulking animatronic nightmares, and Evan jumps out from behind the machine and starts to shoot Bonnie with his slingshot, and it doesn't even make a dent. Now that Evan is out in the open, the robots turn towards him, and David notices that the awful smell is growing stronger and realizes that it must be coming from the animatronics themselves. If you haven't put it together by now, the reason that the Chica suit smells terrible is because Greg's decomposing corpse is inside of it. We'll get to why the Bonnie suit smells terrible a little later, although some of you may have figured that out by now as well. But back to the story, both Henry and David jump out of their hiding places and try to fire their slingshots at the robots, but they soon realize that it's no use. They have no choice but to run. Chica turns its attention towards David and starts to march towards him shockingly quickly. David turns around and runs directly into Evan, who is completely terrified at this point. He has tears in his eyes and tells David that he just wants to go home. They grab Henry, and David tells them that their only hope is to run past Chica and Bonnie down the hallway and then smash the glass door with their slingshots and escape. The three kids agree on this plan and start sprinting down the hallway. Notably, they have to pass by both Chica and Bonnie, but neither of the robots attempt to stop them. As soon as they are past them, however, Bonnie and Chica stand side by side to block the entire width of the hallway leading back towards the stage and start walking towards the kids. As the animatronics advance on them, Evan takes out his slingshot, loads it with the coin, and shoots the glass door of the back entrance to the pizzeria, and the glass shatters immediately. This triggers a loud alarm, but the kids don't care. They sprint through the door, getting a few cuts on the way out, and just barely escape Bonnie and Chica, who don't follow them outside. Instead of following the kids, the two animatronics turn the corner and march directly back to the storage room. Now safe, the kids lay on the ground outside of the pizzeria, exhausted. They're only able to rest for a few seconds before David's dad marches out of the house, absolutely furious. He looks at the shattered back door and tells the kids that he will most likely be fired for this. He says he needs to go inside and reset the alarm, and David begs him not to. His dad tells him that they have all caused enough trouble and to just wait silently until he comes back. David's dad goes inside, resets the alarm, and comes back out a few minutes later. I was definitely expecting something bad to happen to David's dad. It just seemed like the book was setting us up for a classic horror moment. Oftentimes, horror stories will have moments where someone who is either unaware of the danger or doesn't take it seriously enough gets killed by the antagonist. The Nightmare on Maple Street does this with a detective character, and you can find this trope all over horror media. I was surprised when David's dad wasn't killed by the animatronics. But anyways, his dad comes out of the pizzeria and is still completely furious. He sees the slingshots and the coins and knows that the kids shot out the glass door. At this point, it's right before sunrise, so it's still kind of dark, and he decides that he will drive Evan back home and tell his parents what happened, and he orders Henry to walk home. Henry protests this and says that he thought he saw Yellow Bear inside the pizzeria. This just pisses David's dad off more because he assumes that all this chaos was caused by their stupid urban legend. Realizing that they won't be able to win this argument, the kids resign themselves to their fates. Evan gets in the car with David's dad, and Henry starts to walk home. David tries to join him, but his dad tells him that it's only a block away, and besides, David is now officially grounded for a week. The kids part ways, and David heads back inside. It's only about an hour until school starts at this point, so David goes to his room and waits there for his dad to get back. His dad comes to the front door and yells back to David that he needs to drive a few hours away to go to a place that can repair the door cheaply. He tells David that he is to go to school, come back home immediately afterwards, and stay inside his room until it is late enough for him to go to bed. David takes the bus to school, and when he gets there, he notices that Mr. Patrick is teaching their class again. Apparently, the police let him go after they couldn't prove he had anything to do with Michael's disappearance. Evan is at school, but he's so upset about the whole situation and presumably being grounded that he gives David the cold shoulder all day. Notably, Henry isn't at school today. Over the course of the day, David gets more and more mad at Mr. Patrick. He is now 100% convinced that he had something to do with William's disappearance. He also seems to somehow blame his grounding and getting in trouble on Mr. Patrick as well. It's like he's projecting all of his life's problems onto his teacher. And again, Mr. Patrick is a vindictive, spiteful, miserable man, but we can be pretty certain of the fact that he had nothing to do with what happened to the kids last night. Because it seems that this yellow bear might have had something to do with everything that has happened, and we know that Mr. Patrick was being held by the police the night that Greg died. So if Greg saw Yellow Bear that night, then it couldn't have possibly been Mr. Patrick. He is really more of a red herring for the audience than anything else, but of course, David doesn't have this information. Despite this fury that he feels towards his teacher, David can't really do anything about the situation. The school day ends and Henry never shows up, so David assumes that he too is grounded. David goes home and sees that there is a message left on the answering machine. It's his dad. He tells him that his car broke down and that he won't be able to be home until the morning. David is honestly pretty relieved about this. He thinks it's better that his dad is away from him as long as possible so he can delay the inevitable lecture that he is sure to receive. He goes to his room and waits around until it starts to get dark, and a little before sunset, he hears the phone ring but doesn't answer it, and the caller leaves a message. It's Henry's mom. She tells David's dad to call her back and says that she assumed Henry was going to be going to school directly from the sleepover, but that he never came home. She is obviously very concerned given that William disappeared recently, and she is worried the same thing is happening again. And David is now convinced that Mr. Patrick took Henry. He figures that Henry went missing just before school started and knows that Mr. Patrick was released from police custody earlier that morning, and that must have been when he took him. He decides that on Monday, he's going to bring his slingshot to school and hit Mr. Patrick as hard as he can with a few of the rocks he collects in his room. I can't even imagine what would happen if a student actually did this to a teacher. I have to think that you would be expelled, but I'm not sure. That would be absolutely wild. But anyways, David goes to sleep and wakes up in the middle of the night to a tapping sound on his bedroom window. This starts our fifth night at Freddy's, and we're really close to the end of the book now. He looks out the window and sees Yellow Bear. More specifically, he sees the ratty Freddy Fazbear costume with yellow fur. It's clear that this isn't an animatronic at all. He can hear a muffled voice coming through the window that is even more muffled by the fact that the speaker is already covered by a mask. He tells David, "I know where your friends are." The voice is almost impossible to make out, but David is convinced that this is Mr. Patrick, and he's too blinded by his anger at this point and decides to make the absolute worst decision possible. David grabs his slingshot and a few of his rocks and heads out through the back door of the house. He sees Yellow Bear walking towards the back door of the pizzeria. David follows after him cautiously, slingshot at the ready. His judgment is completely clouded at this point, but he knows that he wants to make Mr. Patrick pay for what he's done. The issue is that he remembers that when he and his friends were shooting their coins at the animatronics, they just kind of bounced off their faces. So he decides he wants to pull off Mr. Patrick's Freddy mask before he hits him in the face with the full force of a rock. The back door to the pizzeria has been covered by plywood at this point, and David is shocked to see that Yellow Bear has a key in his hands that he uses to open the door. It was noted earlier in the story that there was only one key to the pizzeria, and David's dad carries it on him at all times. This is obviously not true, as Yellow Bear also has a key. Yellow Bear opens the door and sprints down the dark hallway towards the storage room until he is completely out of sight. David cautiously follows behind. He steps into the pizzeria and hears a voice calling to him from down the hall. It says, "Yellow Bear needs help. Your friends are in here." This is similar to the dialogue that we saw on the very first page of the book. It seems that Yellow Bear has used this trick before. David arms his slingshot and walks down the hallway. I will admit that the end of this book kind of kills my suspension of disbelief a bit, because why on earth would you walk down the spooky hallway? It's not worth it at all at this point. I get that David hates his teacher, but he isn't even certain that it's Mr. Patrick in the suit. And I guess if you knew that the person inside the suit, whether he's Mr. Patrick or not, had something to do with your friend's disappearance, you might want to try to hit them with the slingshot, but you'd also probably just want to run away. That's what I would do. I'm just saying that David's particular course of actions would not have been my first move, but moving on. David gets to the doorway of the storage room and can smell that same terrible smell from the night before. At this point, he decides that it isn't worth it anymore and turns around. But just as he does this, Yellow Bear pops out from the darkness and jump scares him. He knocks the slingshot out of his grip and grabs David's wrists with his pale hands. It seems like the Yellow Bear costume has gloves that the person inside usually wears, but they've taken them off in order to have more control over David. He leads David into the storage room and turns on a gas-powered lantern in the middle of the room. He holds him and brings him over to the Bonnie animatronic. Notably, David sees that all of the animatronics have thick ropes that are tying them to the walls. These weren't there the night before, and David thinks that either his dad or this Yellow Bear must have done this to them. He can see that the Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy animatronics seem to be powered on and almost struggling against the ropes. David says they look like hungry dogs being held back by a leash. Yellow Bear is quietly laughing during this entire scene. It's almost a childlike giggle, but it's definitely a lot more sinister given the circumstances. As Yellow Bear continues to laugh, he points his pale, bony finger to Bonnie and says, "William." So like I said earlier, some of you may have guessed this already, but it turns out that William is inside the Bonnie suit because he was killed and then stuffed inside of it. That explains why he said that he saw Yellow Bear outside his window the week that he went missing. It also explains some of the dialogue from the first page of the book. What we read at the beginning of the novel is presumably what Yellow Bear said to William to lure him away from his house. We know that William was obsessed with Freddy Fazbear's and Yellow Bear in general. So Yellow Bear lured him away, killed him, and stuffed his body inside the Bonnie suit. And that is why it was walking around during the second night and chasing David. It's possessed by William. In fact, if you take the first letters of each voice line of the sequence that Bonnie keeps repeating, it spells out W-I-L-L-I-A-M, William. He was trying to tell his friends who he is. During the sleepover, both Bonnie and Chica appeared, but they didn't try to hurt any of the kids. They didn't even try to grab them when they ran past them. They actually stood side by side and herded the kids out the back door. They wanted them to get away, but had no way to communicate with them besides these voice lines. And the awful smell coming from the storage room and the animatronics is, of course, the bodies inside them decomposing. David says that he can even see blood leaking through the costume in places. As he struggles to understand what he's seeing, David tries to wriggle out of Yellow Bear's grasp, but it's pointless. He's just a kid after all, and the person inside the suit is much stronger than him. Yellow Bear points to the Chica suit and says, "Brother." David realizes what this means and starts to scream, but the man in the suit covers his mouth with his hand. Then he points to the Foxy animatronic and says, "Henry." So now we know what happened to Henry. He really did see Yellow Bear last night, and he must have been abducted by him on his walk back home. David bites the dirty, pale hand over his mouth and is able to scream. The man in the suit starts laughing more and more, and David asks him why he's doing this and calls him Mr. Patrick. The man in the suit stops laughing and says, "Who is Mr. Patrick?" David is confused and quietly asks, "Who are you?" The man starts laughing again. With one hand like a vice grip around David's wrist, the man in the suit lets go with his other hand and pulls his mask off, and David doesn't recognize the face that he sees. It's a man in his 50s or 60s who has some patchy stubble growing in and a mop of greasy black hair that looks to be going gray, and also a crazed look in his green eyes. This man is a complete stranger to both David and the audience. He's never seen him before in his life. The man in the suit starts laughing again, and David whispers one more time, "Who are you?" The man in the suit simply replies, "It's me." He pulls David towards the one suit in the room that isn't tied to the wall, the Freddy animatronic. David screams, and then everything goes dark. The book ends with Evan going back to school on Monday. We learn that Mr. Patrick plans on suing the police department and using the money that he'll get from the slam dunk case to buy Freddy's from whoever owns it currently. We also learn that David's dad seems to have gone missing, and the police assume that he ran off with his two sons and suspect that he is responsible for the disappearance of both William and Henry. Evan thinks back about the mysterious disappearances of his friends, what they told him about Yellow Bear, and their strange encounter during the sleepover, and decides that he is going to try to find out what really happened to them. And that is where Five Nights at Freddy's ends. Definitely a little intense for a children's book. I mean, I'm a big believer that kids should have access to some good horror stories, and I worry that modern children's horror, particularly the Goosebumps video game series, are toning themselves down to cater towards children. But I can also see that maybe a book featuring the deaths of 3 kids and what appears to be a creepy serial killer in a mascot costume is maybe a bridge too far to be considered children's horror. And it's actually even 4 kids that die, because at the end of the story, David is presumably killed and stuffed into the Freddy suit. So yeah, pretty terrifying. But I really love this series, and this first book in particular freaked me out so much when I was a kid that I used to have nightmares about it, but I also think that's kind of cool. I'm really glad that I discovered horror so early on, because it led to a lifelong obsession with the genre. I do think that 5NAF might have thrown me into the deep end, but I'd rather have that than the toned down, sanitized children's horror of today. I will say that this first book in particular was always the most intense to me personally. The later books are certainly freaky, but they're also just less kiddie in general. It seems like the backlash to the first book was so intense that the author just decided to really lean into the horror elements of the series out of spite, and I kind of love that. But that had the unintended side effect of making the later books in the series less focused on the kids and more focused on like the greater lore of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. The next book takes place a few years later and follows Evan as he tries to piece together what happened to his friends back in elementary school. It has a more consistent, darker tone throughout. Again, let me know if you'd like me to cover the rest of the books in the 5NAF series. I had a ton of fun writing the script for this video about this obscure kids horror series. If you grew up with the 5NAF books, then let me know what you think in the reply section up above, whether you liked them or not, or whether you thought they were too scary. Remember to follow me here on YouTube if you like this video and give me a 5-star rating. I'm trying to reach 100,000 followers by the end of 2025, and I appreciate all the help I can get. If you'd like to support me further, then consider becoming a page member, where for just $3 a month, you can get early access to all my videos, access to exclusive videos, access to my members only book club, and access to the members only MySpace page. A massive thank you to all my star level members: Maple Amanda, Lucky Ferns, Chris Sheepley, Zara, Loud Paths, Red Shortwave Productions, Healthy Tyler, Vic Snook, Miss Melancholy 16, Boca Coca, Blueberry Dolphin, Sun Poem Report, Moonlight Purple, Jack Slove, Casti Mandione, Excel, Archway Gannon, Writer, Wasp, The Unofficial Rag, Baby Wolf, Goodbye, Sosa, Deposa Zap, Wreck Me, Aura of Gonzal, Modern Jets Matches Minus, Mim Ronda, Quad Scholar Rafa, Ben Wurst, Eliza Marenbith, and Endenim, Analog Wolf, Aussie, Natu, Unsure Robert, Amy Nomurlian, Sanctuary, Fredrickson's Wife, Mars Droughts, Decembery, Content E, Ellis Snow, Respev, Wood, Hannah Slap, Abigail Cartner, Dare Media, Canadites, Gemma Z, Blue Fuzz, Maya Plealing, Location 24, Rye Unlike Bread, Cecilia, Fry Sue, Inside the Community, Oregano, and Rob Moon 2113. Thank you guys for supporting my page. It really does mean the most to me. You guys are all awesome. But that's going to do it for this one, so remember to follow, and I'll see you in the next video. Catch you later. Take me up again, let me see the stars. Is there life on Mars? 'Cause I've run out of luck here on Earth. I'm a wanderer. Another trip around the sun makes these memories flood, and I could wash it down with the atmosphere. You're cool blue and crystal clear. I'm an astronaut flying above, but can't fall in love. Floating alone, brave enough to see the cosmos, too scared to say hello. And I know one day I'll be gold,